So a team that I don't feel like has gotten a lot of attention so far this offseason are the Milwaukee Bucks. I don't think we realize how weird the Bucks season was last year. Like they really just kind of came and went. I remember how excited people were once they picked up Damian Lillard last offseason. And just to see that juxtaposed to how we look at them right now, it's just really weird. We know the injuries hit them in the playoffs and they lost in the first round against the Pacers. But still, even when they were healthy during the regular season, the vibes were just off a bit in Milwaukee. First thing you have to kind of talk about is the coaching situation. Essentially, in under a year, they went through three different head coaches. There's Mike Budenholzer. They let him go and brought in Adrian Griffin. And despite Adrian Griffin getting off to a solid start from a record standpoint, actually a good enough start to earn him a nod as the Eastern Conference All-Star head coach, they still fired him. There was a major rift between him and the players, and they ended up picking up Doc Rivers. And a lot of that was due to like these deferring defensive philosophies. They were trying to figure out the best way to optimize this roster from a defensive standpoint. But I think what we just realized is they just did not have the personnel to be a really good defensive team. For one, Brook Lopez is starting to fall off a little bit defensively. And also they gave up one of the best defensive players, arguably the best defensive player in the league in Jrue Holiday. And in giving up Jrue Holiday, now they're trying to work with Damian Lillard and Malik Beasley to try to be great defensive stoppers out there on the perimeter. And that's just something that those guys are not great at. Malik Beasley gave a lot of effort, but he just never was able to do that at a high level. And we all know that Damian Lillard never in his career has he ever been known as a dominant level defensive player. And I've always said this, you can have an amazing defensive philosophy, amazing defensive scheming. You have to have personnel out there. You have to have guys out there in a roster that is built to compete from a defensive standpoint. And their options were very limited on the perimeter from a defensive standpoint. So that's their biggest focus this offseason, is trying to figure out a way to shore up their defense, especially out there on the perimeter. Both all those things kind of taken into context with the Bucks and how weird their season was with injuries and those coaching issues. You can't help but wonder about how different the East would have looked if they weren't running into all those things. Like the question does become, is the Celtics path to the NBA Finals as easy as it was if the Bucks were fully healthy, if they didn't run into all those weird situations? Probably not, right? And I know I don't like to play like those ifs and hypotheticals and kind of take the credit away from Boston, but the Bucks were just so out of rhythm. They were so off last year. The Celtics kind of got away with not having to deal with a trio of Chris Middleton, Damian Lillard, and Giannis throughout the postseason, and they would have definitely made a big-time difference. So with all that being said, right, the biggest focus this offseason was trying to figure out a way to get better from a defensive standpoint, and a return to them playing defense at a high level would possibly get them back on track to where they were at in 2021, because fact of the matter is their response to winning that title in 2021 has been weak. They did not put up a great title defense at all. Just years and years of disappointment. And that's kind of a theme right now across the entire league, is teams who are winning the titles aren't doing a great job at defending those titles. So let's kind of go back and look at the Lakers. 2020, they win a championship. Then they make a bunch of roster moves. And since then, they have been absolutely disappointing. Since then, they've gone through Frank Vogel, Darvin Ham, and now obviously JJ Redick. Or go look at the Warriors. 2022, they won a title. And since then, they have been extremely disappointing. So disappointing to the point where their big three of Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, and Draymond Green is broken up, with Klay Thompson choosing to go to another team. Or look at the Nuggets. They won a title last year. We think they're going to be the team to establish the next dynasty, but they lose in the second round to the Minnesota Timberwolves. So it's not just the Bucks that haven't done a great job at defending their title. It's a theme right now across the league, and that's why the league is so wide open. There is no active dynasty. There has been no team that's shown they're good enough to win a title for multiple years. But that window for the Bucks is still open, especially with the roster they have and the talent they have between those guys in Chris Middleton, Damian Lillard, and Giannis. So on to what they've done this offseason to kind of counter some of those issues they had last year. They went and picked up Gary Trent Jr., one of my favorite players, on a 1-year deal. So the goal is to get a strong perimeter defender out there next to Damian Lillard. If you're going to have a guy who is like a high volume scorer out there, but isn't a strong defensive player, you want to pair him alongside with a really strong defensive off guard, right? If we kind of look at Damian Lillard's career, he's rarely been in a situation where he's been out there in a backcourt along with a strong defensive two guard. That was an issue that he and CJ McCollum had. Offensively, those guys were amazing, but none of them were high level defenders. And again, that was an issue just last season. So Gary Trent Jr. is a really good 3-and-D player at his best, but people were a little torn on him coming over and him having this role of being like a point of attack defender for the Bucks. For one, Raptors fans have mixed reviews on Trent Jr. A lot of times he was kind of known to gamble on the defensive end, which can be a huge liability, and struggled at times guarding on the ball. And what the Bucks are going to need is someone who can guard at the point of attack, rotate well, and navigate through screens. So he's not as easy to switch off of and things like that. And it creates a million different mismatch scenarios and everything. And like I said, Raptors fans just did not get an amazing defensive version of Gary Trent Jr. Luckily, Gary Trent Jr. has shown at some point in his career, when he was with the Blazers especially, that he can be an elite level 3-and-D player, right? And so I think right now, he has every incentive in the world to just be dominant again on that end. He's on a 1-year deal, so he's going to be playing for more money essentially this particular season. He's on a contender, and he's playing with someone who he already has a ton of working chemistry with in Damian Lillard. Those guys have played together. They have great chemistry. They have great rapport with one another. So I think that's going to be a good motivator for Gary Trent Jr. to return to being a really, really good defensive player and being that all defensive level guy that we thought he could end up being earlier in his career. That was kind of the expectation for him after he went over to Toronto, that he would continue to be one of the best two-way threats in the league, and he just fell off a bit. But this is new scenery, a new area for him to kind of do his thing, and I think the biggest need is going to be his defense, and this is an opportunity for him to get back to focusing on that end of the basketball. From an offensive standpoint, you're not going to get a ton of shot creating from him. You're not really going to ask him to do that. He can, but there's already enough of that between Chris Middleton and Damian Lillard. But essentially what he's going to do is space the floor for you and knock down shots around Dame and Chris Middleton. He is a career 39% three-point shooter. Last season, he shot 39% from three in 71 games and is a really good catch and shoot guy. I think he's just as good as Malik Beasley from a catch and shoot standpoint out there on the 3-point line. And so he has more upside defensively than Malik Beasley does, on top of being just as good of a shooter as Beasley. So essentially right there, that is an upgrade from what you had out there on the backcourt between Malik Beasley and Damian Lillard. Because he has more upside as a defender, that is a plus relative to Malik Beasley, who is known as a weak defender. So here, Gary Trent Jr. can get back to focusing on being an all defensive level player. There is this niche need for that on this roster, and that's what he has to come and bring to the table. And I don't doubt he'll be able to do that now that he's been in a situation that makes a lot more sense than what was going on there in Toronto these last couple of years. Then on top of that, they went and got Taurean Prince, who also is not a dominant level defender, but is capable and can also stretch the floor and knock down shots. He did that in LA, and that's what he'll be able to do here coming off the bench for the Milwaukee Bucks. So these are relatively lower profile moves compared to some of the other moves you've seen out in the Eastern Conference, like the Knicks. They went and picked up Bridges to pair alongside with Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle, right? That's essentially 3 all-star caliber guys on one roster. Or we saw the 76ers pick up Paul George, right? So now they have 3 all-star players between him, Tyrese Maxey, and Joel Embiid. So we've seen a lot of big moves out in the Eastern Conference. What the Bucks have done is more low-key, but as I said, they filled out some of their more niche needs. We know they needed to get better from a perimeter defensive standpoint, and having better personnel allows whatever scheme they have coming into next season, allows it to work a lot better. So while these were smaller moves, sometimes those smaller moves can be the difference between you being a contender and also just being a team that's on the brink of contention. And last season, they were on the brink of contention. I think these small moves and getting these guys within these roles makes them a true contender again. We saw that with the Celtics, right? I mean, Drew Holiday is a great player, but he filled out a niche need for them, right? As a really good switchable defender, someone who can be very versatile from an offensive standpoint. They weren't asking him to come in and average like 20 points per game and be an all-star. They needed him to fill a certain role on the offensive end to kind of temper things down a little bit, and it worked. They are dominant from an offensive standpoint the entire year. So filling out those niche needs are huge difference makers for a lot of teams. We're really accustomed to seeing these big name moves happen, happen, like the Paul George move or whatever the case may be. We're accustomed to seeing that and looking at that as the difference between the team being a contender and not being a contender. Those small niche moves can be huge difference makers. And I think the Bucks have done a good job making those smaller moves so far throughout this offseason. So we'll see what other moves they end up making this particular offseason and summer, but they've done a good job at building this roster around that trio of Chris Middleton, Dame, and Giannis. At this point, only thing stopping this team is going to be injuries, but they've got more chemistry. They have an entire offseason now to figure out a system that works. Doc Rivers now has an entire offseason to figure that part out because he kind of came at the middle part of last season, which isn't really a good enough time to figure something out that's going to work to win a title. I don't know how many times we've seen a coach get fired in the middle of the season. They bring in another guy and they end up winning a championship. Maybe 2016. That's probably it, where the Cavs got rid of David Blatt and brought in Tyronn Lue, but that's a really rare situation. So hopefully these are the moves that are going to help put the Bucks back on top out in the Eastern Conference in what is going to be a very tough conference next year between the 76ers, the Celtics themselves, the Knicks, and other squads that are kind of out there. The Heat are definitely still going to end up being in the mix. So the East is going to be very interesting, but I think Milwaukee has done a really good job at shoring up this roster, shoring up this defense, and I'm excited to see also how they utilize some of their younger guys that they've gotten through the draft and how they've been playing throughout the summer league, which has been impressive so far. But they did a great job with this roster so far, again, getting those guys to fill out those niche needs. And we'll see if they're able to execute coming into next season.